So we're going to start off talking about the history of biblical archaeology, Syro-Palestinian archaeology. I guess we should start off explaining what that is. We're here for a purpose. We're here to study this idea of biblical archaeology. Archaeology in general is the study of past human societies, primarily through the recovery and analysis of the material culture and environmental data which they've left behind, looking at all the stuff we find in the dirt. Includes things like artifacts, architecture, biofacts, cultural landscapes, and all that other fun stuff. The purpose of archaeology is to recover all this material culture, and we attempt to reconstruct their history. How did they live? What did they do? Bringing all this into the biblical world, biblical archaeology, then it's exactly the same thing, except for now we're dealing with stuff related to the Bible. That's what biblical archaeology is. It is archaeology of the Bible. Since the point is to analyze and understand the history and life of the ancient peoples, biblical archaeology is not primarily set up to be an apologetic. We use it in apologetics, but it's not designed to be an apologetic tool. It's kind of a secondary purpose for it. It's the purpose of biblical archaeology is to simply understand the people. Now, along the way, we get all these really interesting confirmations in biblical archaeology, and that's what we use. That's what we use as our apologetic information. I said before that biblical archaeology is the fourth biblical language. We have our Greek, our Hebrew, our Aramaic, and then finally archaeology. We use this to interpret the text, to learn more about the text. Biblical archaeology specifically is the field of study whereby our research is aimed at the evidences that can allude to the Bible. So when we're talking about this, we're looking to land Israel, Jordan, Syria, whatever, and we're trying to find all this stuff, but biblical archaeology realize that it's separate from Syro-Palestinian archaeology, which is just regular old archaeology in this area. It's normal archaeology. All right, let's talk about the history of this. In the early period of biblical, who was the first archaeologist? I personally think the first archaeologist was the guy that was walking along and was like, hey, that looks pretty cool. And he picked it up and he set it on the shelf. Whoever that guy was, wherever he was, he found something old and he set it on a shelf and he looked at it for a while. He was the first archaeologist.
Dr. Jones.
Long before Dr. Jones. Or, maybe he was building his house. The gentleman I met named Yusuf, he was telling me that as he was trying to correct his mother's house and dig along the foundation, come to find out that the floor of his house is the ceiling of an ancient monastery. And he said, what do I do? So he went to the Jordanian Antiquities Authority and said, what do I do? And they said, it's too recent, don't worry about it, you're fine. And I guess, well, that stuff's all over the place. Who cares about that new stuff? We're interested in the old stuff. So he was an archaeologist because he was digging around and he found something old in the dirt. In the early period of archaeology, of what we know as archaeology, it really started off with a lot of people finding a lot of interest in exploring the Holy Land. They were wanting to find out what kind of stuff is around there. The Western world became extremely fascinated with these ancient things, especially when they began to find these wonderful monuments. And, ooh, look at those pyramids, and look at this big thing over here. It actually wasn't even Israel that brought the attention. It was Mesopotamia and Egypt. And they started getting all this stuff. Oh, let's bring the mummies back. Let's grind the mummies up and put them in pills and we'll swallow them and make us healthy. Yeah, they did that. Isn't that weird?
They did.
They did.
Left.
Yes, they did. Anyway, so really this early stage of archaeology, as you see in your note there, it was a bunch of treasure hunters. People wanting to make major discoveries and just rip things out and take them back and put them in their national museums. And so they would go out, and they would dig, they would find, and then bring back. And we are very thankful that they kind of started this journey, but at the same time, we're also very irritated with them because archaeology is a very violent sport. And as you dig down through the dirt, you've now disturbed it, and you can never dig through that dirt again. So you have these people digging through the dirt looking for something. I'm looking for Troy. And they're digging down through, and they go right through the Troy that we want, and they go right down, here it is, and they disturbed everything. So there are these problems with archaeology. And the early guys were very thankful for what they did, but at the same time, were very annoyed by them as well. So in the early stages of archaeology, Syro-Palestinian archaeology, we find these guys who really just had a hankering to find something. They wanted to be famous. They wanted to get the gold, the hav. They wanted to find the gold, and they wanted to find all the fun stuff. Eventually, we get into archaeology as an academic discipline, where we're finished with this whole treasure hunt thing. We need to get some structure to this. Ortiz says, the synthesis of the archaeology of Israelite history, the cornerstone of biblical archaeology, is attributed to a guy by the name of Albright. You should be familiar, or something somewhat maybe familiar with that name. It was Albright and his contemporaries who inaugurated this paradigm of coalescing the archaeological record with the biblical text. So we're kind of, we're still doing the whole Mesopotamian Egypt thing, but let's look at the biblical text. Let's try to figure out what's going on over there in Israel. Albright excavated Tel Beit Mersim, and this became the turning point for this discipline as an academic concept. His excavation set the template for what excavations are supposed to be. Specifically, his ceramic analysis within the biblical periods. And he would integrate these ideas of archaeology and history into the realm of biblical studies. So archaeology is now becoming a subdivision of biblical studies. And we have a lot to thank Albright for. He wrote the first synthetic work that incorporated archaeological and biblical data, titled The Archaeology of Palestine, in 1949. Just happened to be looking at some books down our library and came across it. In this, he championed the conquest model of the Israelite settlement. Remember, we were talking about that before. He gives it the wrong date. He kind of fudges on the date, but he kind of, at this early stage, he champions this idea of Israelite conquest. The idea that the cities recorded in Joshua were destroyed in one singular event when a new ethnic group came in. Yigal Yadin, next guy on our list there, adopted Albright's paradigm. He excavated at Hatzor, and he associated the destruction level with the Battle of Joshua. What really made him famous, though, was when he found these monumental gate systems at Megiddo and Gezer. And this became the classical case study for associating actual archaeological finds with the biblical character. Because he believed that these gate systems were built during the Solomonic building projects recorded in 1 Kings 9:15. He went on to establish Yadin went on to, not Solomon. Yadin went on to establish the Israeli school, but he was also influential during this period as he inaugurated kind of the archaeology of the United Kingdom of Israel. Like, well, let's look for Saul and David and Solomon, especially when we found those gates. At this time in history, archaeology, as I said before, was seen as a subclass of biblical studies. Biblical studies, and then you have some archaeologists under that. You have your exegetes over here, you have your linguists over here, and you got your archaeologists. We belong to biblical studies. That was the concept at that time, and that carried on through most of the 50s and 60s. Even today, some people still consider themselves biblical archaeologists versus an archaeologist, though in the standard secular world, archaeology is completely separate from biblical studies. This paradigm continued with Albright's student, G.E. Wright, who attempted to mix archaeology with theology in the early biblical theology movement. Now, when I say biblical theology, it's different from what we think of biblical theology today. Biblical theology back then was a very short-lived idea that was only occurred in the American schools. James Barr kind of shot them out of the water, and they don't really exist today. A few forms, but not as a major.
What's the time period of these people?
50s, 60s,
50s, 60s?
40s, 50s. So, yeah,
And you talk about 19?
Yes, yes. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Yes. So they very, very close. Archaeology is a very young concept, and we're still growing. We're still learning. So the fact that it's so young, it didn't become an academic discipline until so recently, is why. First, why we don't have a whole lot of finds, but second, makes it really interesting that, I guess we said before, the finds that we do have are really good finds.
Do non-biblical archaeologists and biblical archaeologists have a tendency to work together, or do they fight against each other, or is it kind of
A lot of
some do,
fighting.
some don't?
It depends. Actually, that's going to be in the next one. If you flip
Okay.
the page in your notes, you'll see the kind of a breakdown of different people. Some people, well, biblical archaeologists most people don't even consider that a discipline anymore. They say, well, that's just one of those Bible guys. Some of the major schools are now getting rid of the biblical archaeology out of their degree programs, and they're just changing over to Syro-Palestinian archaeology, so that the person with the degree now has some sort of clout in the actual real secular world. So yeah, there is a lot of fighting, and there are a whole lot of secular archaeologists out there who, they're taking over the field. There are very, very few true, very conservative archaeologists. Very few.
So, consequently then, those that you speak of, and there are many, right, would not most likely have knowledge of the Bible and anything they found for the most part?
Well,
I'm getting ahead of things.
yeah, you're getting ahead because I have a specific thing on that. But just to give you a little teaser, there are different levels. Some go so far as to say, oh, that's in the Bible? Okay, that's definitely what I'm not going to find here. And they really do that.
Wow.
They look at the Bible first to find out what's not going to be in the dirt. So some go that far. Not everybody, but some go that far.
Wow.
Back into this academic discipline concept. Again, we have G.E. Wright, who he began to mix this archaeology with theology. While this was going on, we've got Dame Kathleen Kenyon, if you remember her. She comes from the British school, and she was developing new techniques and methodologies with her excavations in Jericho, Jerusalem, and Samaria, as Henry alluded to earlier. Some of the aspects of her techniques are still used today. I brought with me the excavation manual that the 3 credit students will be using. Reading out of this, I've got it in my notes here, so I'll read it here. According to the excavation manual, the method of excavation used by the Manitoba Plains project owes much to Dame Kathleen Kenyon's strict attention to the stratigraphy of earth layers. Remember we were talking how she, when you would, here's our hill, and she would cut this out, and this is a bulk. And as you're digging, you're always making sure you've got that extremely clean and straight up and down. And then you can see things. You can see different layers in there, and you can see that somebody had dug a pit here because the colorations are different, and you find things. And so she would mark these things. This idea of stratigraphy is kind of her concept, and really helped us out greatly in creating this academic discipline idea. So we owe a lot to her, to the stratigraphy, her strict attention to the stratigraphy of earth layers, especially in relationship to other things like walls. I'm not going to draw it. Which she imported. She imported to the Near East from England, where Sir Mortimer Wheeler had developed it, sometimes called the Wheeler-Kenyon method. At Jericho, Lawrence Toombs and Joseph Calloway learned the method from her, and then they brought it over to Wright's excavation at Balata, Shechem. And then Wright combined Kenyon's stratigraphy with Albright's pottery, and it kind of formed this idea that we use today, kind of joining all these things together. There's still more to come. We add more things in, but I'll talk about that later. this period of archaeology is considered the heyday of archaeology, especially when it appeared that archaeological research was continuously supporting the accounts found in biblical text. Constantly finding things, Some of those things we found, well, we've kind of thrown them out now and said, well, that wasn't exactly what they said it was. They were very excited. But we still have lots of great stuff. Eventually, the more evolutionary-minded liberals would come in and they tell us that, well, we just throw all that stuff out. Let's just start over. Which gets us into, not yet, but what you were asking about. Some would say that Albright and Yadin's conquest model was now brought into question. Which I would agree, because Albright's conquest model was at the wrong time. And so there are questions concerning his conquest model. His conquest was a lot later than a biblical conquest, which is why we have so much questions about his model. It doesn't work out. Then we go from treasure hunting to the academic discipline to what we now call the processual approach, or new archaeology. This is the next major period of archaeology in this part of the world. And it's characterized by the adopting of methodologies from other disciplines. So now we're starting to look, what are you guys doing over there? Oh, that's good, let's bring this in. So we're looking at other disciplines and trying to come up with new methodologies. The two dominant methodologies were landscape archaeology, in terms of focus, and I'll talk about that in a second, and processual archaeology in terms of how we're going to do it, strategy. It was in 1964 when Aharon's The Land of the Bible was translated in English, and suddenly we have a shift in how we're going to do our archaeology, how we're going to do things. Archaeology really became kind of an anthropological concept at this point. Whereas before we're interested in, okay, where's Solomon? Where's David? Okay, dig. Ooh, there he is. Where's Hezekiah? Things like that. Now the approach is, who are these people? Who were the Israelites? Who were the Canaanites? Who were the Ammonites? And they begin to kind of start off, they add, this is that whole adding disciplines. I guess before you could call it an academic discipline, but really it was just an academic treasure hunt. So it's like the cross between the treasure hunt, the academic treasure hunt, and then finally the new archaeology. The archaeologists are now doing things like they're considering ideas as settlement patterns and demographics and how the environment has changed over the ages. This idea of le longue durée, rather than just simply documenting historical events and the political history. Not only was all the landscape stuff going on, but William Deaver, Wild Bill Deaver as he has been called, was introducing the paradigm shift of new archaeology. What he was doing, he was taking all these North American archaeological concepts and he was bringing them over here into the Middle East. So we have the Kenyan method, which looks at the stratigraphy. And we have Albright's method, which looks at the pottery sequence. And now we're adding in, okay, let's bring in a zoologist. Let's bring in a whateverologist and this other person who studies wells only. And we're bringing all these people into the field and they're helping us out. We're bringing in our linguists and we're mixing things together. And now we're finally all working together in this archaeological journey. What he's really known for, though, is separating biblical archaeology from Syro-Palestinian archaeology. This is the point where it's changed. So again, I said before, biblical archaeology was kind of a subclass of biblical studies. I consider myself a biblical studies guy. My interest is only in biblical archaeology. The rest of it's fascinating, but I really want to know what's related to the Bible. The other guys, they're interested in, oh look, a seed. Let's look at this seed. I'm not too worried about this.
So if you found Jimmy Hoffa, you'd be like,
yeah. Well, I live in Hamilton, which used to be called Little Chicago.
Yep.
Yeah, so
Might be right.
I could, yeah, I might. I might. So all this stuff is going on, but really the big change is this idea of switching over to Syro-Palestinian archaeology. So as I said before, no longer you will often hear people speak of Syro-Palestinian archaeology as opposed to biblical archaeology. It's really just the biblical studies guys who continue to use that phrase. I have no problem with the phrase, but the more secular guys, they have a problem with it. Any questions before I go on to the next? All right, if you turn your page...
I have one.
Notes, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. You used Troy as an example, and they would dig down, and dig right past that to get to what they were looking for. How does, like, a city or a tomb or something get layered over, like, per se, where they built on top of that, there was the monastery underneath the guy's house? Is that, like, just centuries of, like, it's in the desert or something, the dirt blowing in, or do they do, like, a land excavation, or how?
It really all depends. Sometimes you will have a site that's been abandoned for so long that the sands blow over and cover it up.
Okay.
Other times you have, as I was talking about early on in I think one of the first lectures, you have the mud bricks melting away from the rain and causing this stratigraphy. They just got to keep building up the mound, building up the houses. Over time, you have these huge tells, as we saw in some of the pictures. Some of those people say, okay, well, let's kind of start over here, and they just level out the area, and they look and say, oh, look, there's some good stones right there from that old house. Let's just dig these up and use this for my new house, which really causes problems for us, because we would really like it if they would just kind of set down a nice piece of plastic, and then start over again, so that we can tell what's going on. I mean, you've got, like I said, we got these pits going down there, and we've got all this weird stuff going on, and sometimes it's really hard to tell. But typically speaking, you've got bulldoze the area, whatever bulldozers they would have had, and let's just start over. Burial, you've got garbage and junk and stuff, which is really important when you're digging through a house. I was digging in a house at Jalul, and I got to the floor. It's like, okay, well, now let's see what's under the floor. What's under that floor is going to tell us a whole lot about that specific house, because they're going to level out the area, all the garbage is down there, and then they get this dirt, and now we build our house, right? So whatever's under that floor is going to be extremely important. So we're digging down. We do a little probe. This is it was an iron 2 house, and we did this little 1 foot by 1 foot probe, 1 foot down, just to see what's down there. We found very little. But one of the really weird things, we found a ram's horn, not a shofar, but just a ram's horn. And man, that's an iron 2 ram's horn. I was pretty excited about it. But the idea is, okay, if we're going to build a house here, and you're digging and you drop your change down in the dirt, and we level out the house, and now I've got the house. When we look at that, when we dig up that floor and look there, if we found a 2005 coin, we know that house was not built in 2006. So when we look at these pottery, we look at the pottery and say, okay, this is going to at least give us a cutoff time. It's not going to tell us, a whole lot, but at least tells us where the last piece of pottery was. So that's sort of the idea. Does that help?
Yes. One other quick. I built swimming pools down in Florida. I built over 1,000 pools, so I can understand the excavation process. We've had to go in there and tear up decks, pool decks that was old, cracked, abandoned house. Just level it and then start over, on top of that. So I can understand how you can get built on top of it. One thing I don't understand is like on these like temples and stuff. Like he showed a picture of the synagogue in was it Ceres Philippi? You showed a picture of Capernaum. He showed a temple, and it had a rock on it. That apparently that white limestone is easy to work with, but it had a real nice beveled edge on it. Now I've worked with concrete since I was 12, and I know about just the work and stuff that goes into shaping stone and cutting stone. Well, we have like handheld Nikitas, drills, and electricity, for example. These guys didn't have that. What kind of techniques would they have used to bevel their stones back then?
Well, you've seen Flintstones. They've got the little animals running on the things and causing the drills. Actually, I'm not exactly sure. I mean, it's all going to be hand tools. They're not going to
Lots of manpower and slaves and.
Lots of
I mean, they
manpower,
got
yeah.
some of the stuff you see these ancient pictures. I mean, they got some nice cuts on that wood or wood stone,
Yeah.
and you know, it just makes you wonder. Well,
Well, now
kind of
that's-
tools did
that-
they use? You know,
That you saw, that's Roman age, so that's kind of new.
Yes.
That's not all the super old stuff. But you find that's down in the super old stuff too.
I mean, well, regardless, they didn't have electricity.
The Egyptian pyramids are a
Yeah,
classic example
perfect
of
example,
that. You
yeah.
know,
Yeah.
you look at the way that stone is cut on those, and that's 2000 BC and older. So
Yeah, because I've chipped, I've cut, I've grinded on stone, on bricks.
A lot of hard
you
work.
know, for swimming pools and stuff, and spillways, but it's tough.
Yeah.
And it takes it out of you at the end of the day. But I just wonder, how did they do that back then without the electricity? Because we got it. You know, we have the tools now.
Well,
You
they
know?
didn't have union, and they didn't have to take a break to watch TV.
Yeah. Yeah. They also didn't have much food either.
and sometimes it took generations to build things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a
You
good
know,
point too.
Yeah, Herod's temple was the second. The temple at the time of Jesus was built over a very long period of time. Was it it took this temple 46 years to be built, and you'll destroy it in 3 days. Rebuild it in 3 days, so that kind of thing. If I could piggyback one
Yeah, go
thing
ahead.
that he said, you were mentioning about like when you're digging down, you run into something that you're really not interested in, you want to get down further, like the Troy analogy. We ran into this at our site at Makata. We're trying to get down to the fortress walls from the time of Joshua, and we found a first century house.
Yeah. Okay.
That's an example. A good archaeologist, though, needs to pause and do the good work there.
Yeah.
Record, document, do all that kind of stuff, and then really you tear the structure down and you keep going.
And then proceed.
Yeah. So that's what Justin was saying. You kind of destroy
Very
what you
violent.
find after you've drawn it, photographed it, documented it. You've done all that, then you tear it apart, and you keep going. So it's kind of it's interesting, but you have to deal with what you find. So in the sense that it slows us down. But it's good scientific research. We got to slow down,
Right.
and you got to deal with what comes to you.
Well, that makes more. Now I get what you were saying about they hit this and then just go right through it. They wasn't stopping before proceeding.
No,
Yeah,
they
that's
say,
what you're talking
that's not what we're looking for. Let's keep going.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's not really the good way to do it. You really should document, because you never know what could be found there too. I mean, we have found coins from the time of Jesus, from the times before that. Really interesting finds in this house. Kind of a treasure of different discoveries that we didn't expect. So.
Now that doesn't really happen a whole lot today. I mean, I'm sure there's still people around that dig awfully fast, but that was kind of in the early days
Yeah.
where they're looking for something specific and they don't care what they're digging through.
Yeah, I didn't understand how they would
Yeah.
get the layers. What causes a layer?
Okay.
Yes, I get that now.
Just the grave robbers now.
Yeah, and they were just treasure hunters. That's all they wanted. They wanted to find that good thing and take it back. And a friend of mine right now he's writing his PhD dissertation on I can't remember what the site was. I probably shouldn't name it anyway. But the guy who excavated the site, was an old drunk out there excavating, and he kept terrible records. He's finished decade ago, and finally he just said, you know what, I'm not going to publish this. Here, you do it. This school, here's all my paperwork, here's all my stuff. And then they said, okay, well, PhD dissertation, your turn. And he said he's going through this stuff, and it's like, whoever is like terrible documentation. So most of the stuff he's looking at is garbage. So all that destruction of going down through there was not documented well enough, so it's now lost. So it's a very violent sport. Very violent.
The countries today have much stricter requirements about who they allow into the country to excavate now. It's a much more professionally done type of thing. I think a lot of these, old archaeologists, in many cases, were well-meaning. Some not so much, but it's just that the techniques and the sciences advanced quite a bit. And then the countries, it was also during the time of British imperialism. So
Yeah.
if you're in Egypt and you're excavating, well, Egypt doesn't really have control over what goes on. The Brits were in control of it. That sort of stuff. But once that stopped, and these countries got more of their own autonomy, they developed a lot more strict standards as to what they wanted. So.
And about when did the academic discipline start? What year?
It started with Albright. Albright was don't know if I have a.
1920s, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, because he died in the early 70s.
Yeah. It sounds.
So I think he was around.
I've got it on my thing. Sorry.